The sun was setting on the horizon of Chicago, painting the sky in orange hues that reflected off the hundreds of mirrored windows of the imposing Tech Minds building, one of the largest artificial intelligence companies in the country. On the U50th floor, Edward Matthews observed the city through the windows of his corporate penthouse while absent-mindedly swirling the whiskey glass in his hands. At 52, he was the picture of success: well-trimmed grey hair, impeccable Italian suit, and a posture that emanated power. His technological empire had revolutionized both national and international markets with artificial intelligence innovations that promised to change humanity's future. But that afternoon, something was troubling him. A storm was approaching, both in the sky and in his life, though he didn't know it yet. "Mr. Matthews," his secretary's voice sounded through the intercom. "Your son Luke is here." Edward took a deep breath, preparing himself for another confrontation. "Send him in, Rachel." Luke Matthews, 25, entered the room like a storm. His disheveled dark hair and casual clothes contrasted with the corporate environment. His eyes, identical to his father's, shone with a mixture of anger and defiance. "So it's true?" Luke asked, without greetings. "You're really going to cancel the company's social project?" Edward set his glass down on the marble desk. "Luke, you need to understand that not all projects are economically viable. The AI development program for public hospitals is consuming too many resources." "Resources?" Luke laughed humorlessly. "You're talking about money while people need medical care? Is this what the great Edward Matthews has become? Don't come at me with that idealistic speech. You still have a lot to learn about managing a company of this size. I've learned enough to know that you're not half the man my grandfather was," Luke shot back, touching on an old wound. Edward felt his blood boil. Richard Matthews, his father, had been a pharmaceutical industry giant, respected and feared in equal measure. Now at 78, he lay in a hospital bed, in a coma after a stroke that had struck him 6 months ago. "Your grandfather made tough decisions to build what we have today," Edward responded, controlling his voice. "One day you'll understand." "What I understand is that you're destroying everything good that was left in this family." Luke headed for the door but stopped before leaving. "You know what's the difference between you and Grandpa? He could be tough, but he had a heart. You only have ambition." The door slammed shut, leaving Edward alone with his thoughts and the storm that was beginning to break over the city. He checked his watch. He was late for a crucial meeting in Oak Brook. The helicopter was already waiting for him on the helipad. "Rachel, cancel my appointments for tomorrow morning," he instructed through the intercom. "And let Helen know I'll be home late tonight." His wife, Helen, probably wouldn't be surprised. After 27 years of marriage, she had gotten used to his absences, although Edward knew that each one dug a bigger gap between them. The pilot was waiting, worried about the weather conditions. "Mr. Matthews, maybe we should postpone. The storm is getting worse." "We don't have that option, Carl. I need to be at this meeting." As the helicopter took off, Edward watched the city lights being swallowed by the curtain of rain. His thoughts wandered between Luke's words and memories of his father. Richard had always been a shadow in his life, an intimidating presence that not even the coma had managed to diminish. The helicopter was crossing the storm with difficulty, shaking violently. Edward tried to focus on the documents on his tablet, numbers and graphs that would show investors the bright future his company promised. That's when an intense flash illuminated the entire cabin. "Mr. Matthews, we're having problems," Carl shouted, struggling with the controls. The world spun in slow motion. The lightning had hit the main rotor, and now they were in free fall. Edward saw his life flash before his eyes. The fights with Luke, Helen's disappointed look, his father's stern face the last time he had seen him conscious. The impact was violent: twisted metal, shattered glass, and then darkness. When Edward regained consciousness, he was surrounded by flames. The pain was unbearable, especially in his face and hands. Through the smoke, he could see Carl being rescued by paramedics. "Hang in there, sir," a voice shouted near him. "We're going to get you out of there." As he was pulled from the wreckage, Edward Matthews didn't know that this was just the beginning of his transformation, that the man who would emerge from that accident would be very different from the magnate who had entered the helicopter, and that the secrets his father had kept were about to come to light, forever changing the course of their lives. Rush University Medical Center had never seemed so quiet to Helen Matthews. Sitting in the waiting room of the burn unit, she observed her distorted reflection in the polished marble floor. The last 48 hours had been a whirlwind of emotions since she had received the call about Edward's accident. Luke arrived hurriedly, his red eyes betraying a sleepless night. "Any news, Mom?" Helen shook her head, mechanically adjusting the skirt of her dress. "The doctors are still evaluating the extent of the damage." Her voice faltered on the last word. "Mrs. Matthews?" A tall, grey-haired doctor approached. "I'm Dr. Frank Anderson, head of the team taking care of your husband." Helen and Luke stood up instantly. The doctor led them to a private room where human body maps and diplomas decorated the white walls. "I'll be direct," Dr. Anderson began, his face grave. Mr. Matthews suffered severe burns, mainly on his face and hands. "The damage is extensive. Although we've managed to stabilize him, the injuries are irreversible by conventional treatment methods." Luke clenched his fists. "And what are the alternatives?" The doctor hesitated for a moment. "There is a possibility, but it's experimental. Dr. Michael Sanders in Rochester has developed a revolutionary technique for total face and hand transplant. He has already performed some successful procedures, although his methods are controversial." "Controversial how?" Helen asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Dr. Sanders was removed from several institutions for performing procedures without prior approval from ethics committees. However, his results are undeniable. He is possibly the only surgeon in the country capable of giving Mr. Matthews a chance to recover his appearance." Helen and Luke exchanged worried looks. Dr. Sanders' name wasn't unfamiliar. It had appeared in several medical scandals in recent years, always shrouded in controversies about his questionable practices. "And what about donors?" Luke questioned. "How does this process work?" It was at this moment that Rachel, Edward's secretary, burst into the room. Her normally composed face was marked by anxiety. "Mrs. Matthews, we need to talk. It's about Mr. Richard." Helen felt a chill run down her spine. Richard, her father-in-law, was hospitalized in the same hospital, in a coma for 6 months. "There's been a significant deterioration in his condition," Rachel explained. "The doctors, they don't have much hope." A heavy silence fell over the room. It was Luke who first understood the implication of those words. "Doctor, theoretically, could my grandfather be a compatible donor?" Dr. Anderson adjusted his glasses, thoughtful. "Well, being father and son, the genetic compatibility would be high. But this is a very delicate decision that needs to be considered carefully." Helen felt the world spin. The idea of Edward waking up with Richard's face seemed like a nightmare. She knew well the complicated relationship between father and son, the expectations never met, the words never spoken. "We need to consult Dr. Sanders immediately," Helen decided, surprising everyone with her firmness. "If there's a chance to save Edward, we need to try." Dr. Sanders arrived at Rush the following morning. He was a man of average height, prematurely white hair, and unsettling blue eyes. His presence caused a mix of hope and apprehension in the medical team. "The case is perfectly suitable for my technique," he declared after examining Edward and Richard's tests. "With the genetic compatibility between father and son, the chances of success are even higher." "And the risks?" Helen asked, watching the doctor closely. "Besides the normal risks of complex surgery, there's a possibility of rejection. But the most challenging will be the psychological aspect. Your husband will need to adapt to a new appearance, the appearance of his own father." Luke, who had been quiet during the entire consultation, finally spoke up. "And what about the ethics of all this, Doctor? I've read about your controversies." Dr. Sanders smiled enigmatically. "Young man, ethics in medicine is like a moving horizon. What seems controversial today may be standard procedure tomorrow. Your family has a choice to make. Accept the limitations of conventional medicine or give your father a second chance." Helen watched through the hospital window as night fell over Chicago. Somewhere among those lights, Edward's helicopter had crashed, changing their lives forever. Now she needed to make a decision that would alter not only her husband's future, but that of the entire family. Dr. Sanders had left the consent forms on the table. The pen weighed in her hand like lead. Edward had always been a man of difficult decisions. Now it was her turn to make a choice for him. "Mom," Luke called softly, "the doctors need an answer." Helen took a deep breath, remembering Edward's face, a face she might never see again. With a steady hand, she signed the documents authorizing the experimental procedure. What she didn't know was that that signature marked not only the beginning of a revolutionary surgery, but also the awakening of secrets long buried in the Matthews family history. The operating room at Rush University Medical Center had been specially prepared for the procedure. Dr. Michael Sanders watched his team make the final preparations while methodically sterilizing his hands. Through the glass of the adjoining room, Helen and Luke waited anxiously, like spectators to a macabre play. "We'll start with the tissue preparation procedure," Dr. Sanders announced to his team. His hands moved with the grace of a conductor, coordinating the surgical ballet unfolding before him. "Every minute is precious." The surgery extended for 18 grueling hours. Outside, Helen alternated between periods of silent prayer and long walks through the hospital corridors. Luke remained motionless, observing every movement through the glass, as if he could influence the outcome just by his concentration. Rachel, the secretary, arrived periodically with coffee and updates about the company. TechMinds continued to function, but rumors about Edward's condition were beginning to affect the company's stocks. The board was restless, and investors were demanding answers. It was during the 15th hour of surgery that something inexplicable happened. The lights in the operating room flickered for a brief moment, and Edward's cardiac monitors registered an abnormal pattern of heartbeats. Dr. Sanders paused for a moment, observing the devices with curiosity. "Doctor, the vital signs," a nurse began. "I know," he responded, a strange gleam in his eyes. "Fascinating." The procedure continued, but that moment would be etched in the team's memory. When it finally ended, Dr. Sanders left the operating room with an enigmatic expression on his tired face. "The surgery was a technical success," he announced to Helen and Luke. "Now we need to wait for the recovery period. The next few days will be crucial." "When can we see him?" Helen asked, her voice betraying exhaustion. "Soon, but I need to prepare you. His appearance will be different. The face you'll see will be Richard's, but younger, adapted to Edward's facial structure. It's important that you keep this in mind." The following days were a test of patience. Edward remained in an induced coma while his body adapted to the changes. Helen spent hours by his bedside, observing the face that was now a strange mixture of her husband and her father-in-law. It was on a rainy afternoon, 5 days after the surgery, that Edward began to show signs of consciousness. His fingers, now with the marks and wrinkles characteristic of Richard's hands, moved slightly on the sheet. "Edward?" Helen called softly, holding his hand. His eyes opened slowly, disoriented. For a moment they seemed to recognize nothing around him. Then they focused on Helen, and something strange happened. His gaze had a different depth, as if other memories inhabited behind them. "Ice, Helen?" His voice came out hoarse, hesitant. "Yes, my love, it's me," she answered, trying to hold back tears. Edward tried to move, but Dr. Sanders, who had just entered the room, stopped him. "Slowly, Mr. Matthews. Your body is still adapting." "Mirror?" Edward whispered. "I need a mirror." Helen and the doctor exchanged worried glances. Dr. Sanders nodded slightly, and Helen took a small mirror from her purse. With trembling hands, Edward held it in front of his face. The silence that followed was deafening. Edward observed every detail of his new appearance, his fingers trembling as he touched the features he had seen on his father's face for so many years. It was like looking at an old photo of Richard, but with subtle differences that made the image even more disturbing. "This is," he began, but his voice failed. "It's temporary," Dr. Sanders quickly intervened. "Over time, the tissues will adapt better, and your appearance will become more your own." But Edward barely heard him. His hands roamed his face, feeling each new curve, each new wrinkle. Suddenly, a strange expression crossed his face, as if he had been hit by a distant memory. "The safe," he muttered, his voice sounding strangely different. "We need to check the safe." "What safe?" Helen asked, confused. Edward blinked several times, seeming to wake from a trance. "I just don't know, it was just a random thought." Dr. Sanders observed the scene with scientific interest, making notes on his clipboard. "This is normal," he explained. "The medication can cause some mental confusion in the first few days." But something in the doctor's tone suggested there was more to the situation than he was revealing. Helen realized that Luke, who had just entered the room, had also noticed something strange. The young man observed his father with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. "Dad," Luke called hesitantly, approaching the bed. Edward turned to his son, and for a moment his expression was identical to the one Richard used to have when looking at him, a mixture of pride and disappointment that Luke knew all too well. "Luke," Edward responded, his voice carrying a tone Helen had never heard before. "We need to talk about the company." The return home, 2 weeks after the surgery, was like entering a strange yet familiar territory. Edward observed every detail of the mansion in Lincoln Park as if seeing it for the first time, although he had lived there for 2 decades. His eyes lingered on certain objects, especially the old family photographs that Helen had insisted on keeping on display. "I had your office prepared just as you like it," Helen commented, trying to fill the uncomfortable silence. "Rachel organized all the company reports for you to review when you feel up to it." Edward nodded distractedly, his fingers still bandaged, but already showing the wrinkled characteristics of Richard's hands, touching the frame of an old photo. In it, a young Richard Matthews smiled alongside other executives in front of a pharmaceutical laboratory. "This photo," Edward murmured, "it was taken on the day Neuroflex was approved." Helen frowned. "How do you know that? I thought you were still in college when Neuroflex was launched." Edward blinked, looking confused. "I don't know, I just know." His hand trembled slightly, and he moved away from the photograph as if it could burn him. The next morning, Edward insisted on going to the office, despite Helen's protests and medical recommendations. TechMinds needed its leader, he argued, especially after weeks of uncertainty. His return caused a commotion. Older employees who had known Richard Matthews couldn't disguise their shock at seeing their former boss apparently rejuvenated walking through the corridors. Rachel, in particular, seemed especially affected. "Mr. Matthews," she stammered when he entered his office, "I prepared all the reports as requested." Edward sat in his chair, a movement that should have been familiar, but now seemed strange. His eyes scanned the room until they fixed on a specific point on the wall. "The safe has been moved," he suddenly declared. Rachel paled. "I'm sorry?" "The safe, it used to be there," he pointed to a spot behind an abstract painting. My father kept it there." "But, sir," Rachel hesitated, "this office was completely renovated 15 years ago when you took over." "The presidency. How could you know where the old safe was?" Edward ran his hand over his face, a gesture that was his, but now carried the shadow of Richard's mannerisms. "I don't know. It's as if the memories were mixed in my mind." That moment, Luke entered the room carrying a folder. Since the accident, he had temporarily assumed some responsibilities in the company, surprising everyone with his competence. "Dad, we need to discuss the social project for public hospitals," Luke began, but stopped when he saw Edward's disturbed expression. "Of course, the project," Edward responded, his voice taking on a different, softer tone. "You know, Luke, your grandfather always believed that a company's true value lies in the good it can do." Luke and Rachel exchanged surprised looks. These words sounded exactly like something Richard would say, not Edward. "Are you all right?" Luke asked, approaching cautiously. "Perfectly," Edward answered, straightening in his chair. "In fact, I've been thinking. We're not only going to maintain the social project, but expand it. And there's something else." He paused, as if listening to a distant voice. "We need to investigate the old files of the partnership with Global Pharmaceuticals." Rachel dropped a pile of papers. Global Pharmaceuticals, but it was closed years ago after that scandal. Exactly, Edward interrupted, his eyes shining with a strange intensity. And I believe there's something important in those files. Something that my father was trying to reveal before the stroke. Luke observed his father with a mixture of fascination and concern. It was as if two different people were inhabiting the same body, alternating control at every moment. "Rachel," Edward called, his voice now carrying that authoritative tone. That was his trademark. "I want all documents related to Global Pharmaceuticals from the last 20 years. And schedule a meeting with Dr. Sanders for tomorrow. There are some questions I need to ask him." When Luke and Rachel left the room, Edward remained seated, contemplating his reflection in the window. The face that stared back at him was a disconcerting mixture of the present and the past, like an overlaid photograph. In his mind, memories that didn't belong to him began to emerge, bringing with them secrets that perhaps should have remained buried. He picked up his cell phone and dialed a number he didn't know he knew. After 3 rings, a female voice answered. "Hello? Marina," Edward heard his own voice say, using a tone he didn't recognize. "This, Sarah?" Mark heard his own voice say, using a tone he didn't recognize. "This is Richard. We need to talk about what happened in 2003. On the other end of the line, there was a stunned silence. "Richard. But that's impossible." Mark hung up. The phone, his hands trembling. Who was Sarah? And why did he feel she was the key to a mystery he didn't even know existed? Sarah Adams watched the imposing facade of the Sunnyvale Cafe in downtown San Francisco with a racing heart. At 65, her elegantly arranged gray hair and dignified bearing still carried the dignity of someone who had held high executive positions. After receiving that disturbing call, she knew the secrets she had kept for 2 decades were about to come to light. Mark arrived punctually, and Sarah had to hold her breath. It was like seeing a ghost. Richard Miller's face, younger but unmistakable, looking at her with a mixture of recognition and confusion. "Sarah," he said, his voice oscillating between 2 different timbres, like a poorly tuned radio. "Mark," she replied, deliberately using his current name. "Or should I call you Richard?" They sat at a discreet table in the back of the cafe. Mark studied Sarah's face, as if trying to put together pieces of a puzzle. "You were the research director at Global Pharmaceuticals," he said, not as a question, but as a memory emerging from the shadows. "And you are Richard Miller's son, not Richard himself, no matter whose face you're wearing now," Sarah responded firmly. "What do you want to know?" "Neuroflex," Mark said abruptly, surprising himself. "There's something about Neuroflex I need to find out." Sarah paled slightly, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. "Some doors are better left closed, Mark. Your father learned that the hard way." "His stroke." "It wasn't natural, was it?" Mark asked, a sudden certainty taking hold of him. "How did you—" Sarah paused, studying him intently. "What exactly is happening to you, Mark?" Mark ran his hands, those hands that were no longer his, over his face. "I have memories, Sarah, memories that don't belong to me. I see meetings I never attended, documents I never read, and I feel there's something terrible I need to uncover." Sarah looked around nervously before leaning forward. Neuroflex was a revolutionary success in treating neurological diseases, but there were side effects that were deliberately concealed. Your father discovered it and was about to expose everything when he had the stroke, Mark completed, feeling a chill run down his spine. "Richard had gathered evidence," Sarah continued, her voice barely a whisper. "Documents, lab tests, emails. He kept everything in." "The safe," Mark interrupted, another alien memory surfacing in his mind. "The safe behind the painting." "Yes," Sarah confirmed, watching him with growing concern. "But the safe was empty when the police investigated. Everything had disappeared." Mark closed his eyes, trying to organize the whirlwind of images and sensations invading his mind. He saw his father, or was it himself? Typing a password, storing documents, making late-night phone calls. "Helen," he murmured, opening his eyes. Helen needs to know something. Richard, my father entrusted something to her. Sarah held his hand across the table, a gesture that seemed loaded with history. Mark, there are powerful people involved in this, people who wouldn't hesitate to cause another accident if they thought it necessary. What people? The consortium, Sarah answered, her voice trembling slightly. A group of executives and politicians who profited millions from Neuroflex. Your father was about to expose all of them. At that moment, Mark noticed a man in a dark suit sitting a few tables away, pretending to read a newspaper, but clearly watching them. We're being watched, he said quietly. Sarah didn't seem surprised. They never stopped watching. Even after all these years, she stood up abruptly. I need to go, but Mark, be careful. You're not the only one who inherited something from your father. Before leaving, she slid a business card across the table. On the back, there was a sequence of handwritten numbers. Back in the car, Mark studied the numbers, feeling they were familiar somehow. It wasn't a phone number nor coordinates. It looked more like the safe combination, he murmured, another of Richard's memories. Emerging. But not from the office safe, there was another safe somewhere else. His phone rang, startling him. It was Helen. Mark, her voice sounded worried. Dr. Sanders is here. He says we need to talk about some unexpected side effects of the procedure. Mark looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. For a moment, he could swear he saw his father's face smiling back at him. I'm on my way, he replied, tucking Sarah's card into his pocket. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but the image they formed was more disturbing than he could have imagined. Dr. Michael Sanders' private office in Beverly Hills was a study in contrasts. Modern furniture shared space with ancient medical statuettes and state-of-the-art equipment vied for attention with dusty traditional medicine books. Helen waited seated in a leather armchair while the doctor arranged a series of exams on his glass desk. Mark arrived still, disturbed by the encounter with Sarah, but tried to maintain his composure. Dr. Sanders greeted him with that enigmatic smile of his that seemed to hide more than it revealed. Mr. Miller, the doctor began, how have you been feeling since our last consultation? The memories, Mark responded directly. You knew this would happen, didn't you? The doctor's smile faltered for a moment. Theoretically, there's a possibility of cellular memories being transferred during complex transplants, but what you're experiencing is something unprecedented. Helen leaned forward, concerned. What exactly are we talking about, Doctor? Your husband is experiencing what we call advanced cellular memory, Sanders explained, his eyes shining with scientific interest. The transplanted tissues carry not only physical characteristics but also neurological information. How is this possible? Mark questioned, his father's hands, closing into fists on the chair arms. Dr. Sanders stood up and walked to a shelf full of files. During my research at Stanford University, I discovered that specialized cells, especially those linked to the peripheral nervous system, can retain much more complex information than we initially imagined. He pulled out an old folder and opened it on the desk. In fact, it was your father, Mr. Miller, who first funded this research through Global Pharmaceuticals. Mark and Helen exchanged alarmed looks. My father funded your research. Oh, yes, Sanders continued, apparently oblivious to the growing tension. The original project was related to the development of Neuroflex. We were studying how drugs could affect cellular memory when... He stopped abruptly, realizing he might have said too much. When what, Doctor? Helen pressed, her voice firm. The doctor adjusted his glasses, uncomfortable. When we discovered something unexpected. The cells not only responded to the drug, they preserved information. It was as if each cell was a tiny biological hard drive. And you use this knowledge in the transplant, Mark concluded, feeling a chill run down his spine. It was a revolutionary scientific breakthrough, Sanders defended himself. Imagine the possibilities, preserving memories, experiences, knowledge. Or secrets, Mark interrupted, his voice taking on that deeper tone that didn't belong to him. Like the secrets my father kept about Neuroflex. Dr. Sanders's face paled slightly. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do, Doctor. Mark stood up, approaching the desk. Just as you know that my father's stroke wasn't natural, it was caused by Neuroflex itself, wasn't it? Helen stifled an exclamation. Sanders remained silent for a long moment before responding. Your father discovered severe side effects, he finally admitted. The drug could cause severe neurological damage in certain patients. When he threatened to expose everything, the consortium acted, Mark completed, another of Richard's memories emerging. But they didn't count on this, did they? On the possibility that my father's memories would survive through the transplant. Dr. Sanders ran his hand through his white hair, suddenly looking aged. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The procedure was only meant to save your life, give you a new face. But you knew this could happen, Helen accused. You knew the memories could be transferred. It was a theoretical possibility, the doctor defended himself. But the extent of what's happening is extraordinary and potentially dangerous. Mark sat down again, feeling dizzy. Dangerous how? The memories are becoming stronger, aren't they? Sanders asked, leaning forward. More vivid, more dominant. Mark nodded slowly, remembering the episode with Sarah, how easy it had been to pass as Richard. If we don't control this, Sanders continued, there's a risk that your father's memories will become permanent, that they'll replace your own memories. Helen stood up abruptly. This can't happen. There must be something we can do. The doctor hesitated before answering. There's an experimental procedure that could suppress the transferred memories, but that would mean losing the evidence against the consortium, Mark completed, finally understanding the dilemma. Losing the chance to expose the truth about Neuroflex. Dr. Sanders nodded gravely. The choice is yours, Mr. Miller, but I suggest you decide soon. The more time passes, the harder it will be to distinguish where Richard Miller ends and where Mark Miller begins. At that moment, Mark's phone vibrated. It was a message from Lucas. Dad, I found something in the company's old files. Something about a secret lab. We need to talk. Mark looked at his reflection in the office window. 2 consciousnesses, 2 lives, 2 missions. And now, an impossible choice to make. The old warehouse in Oakland seemed abandoned for years. Its peeling walls telling stories of a long-forgotten industrial past. Lucas parked his car next to Mark's, watching his father examine the place with a distant expression as if reliving memories from another life. I found the deeds in the old files, Lucas explained, showing a worn folder. The property still belongs to the old Global Pharmaceuticals subsidiary, but it's registered under a shell company. No one would connect this to the main company. Mark touched the warehouse wall with his wrinkled hands. Richard's hands. The secret lab, he murmured. This is where it all began. How do you know that? Lucas asked, still getting used to the moments when his father seemed to transform into his grandfather. Richard, your grandfather personally supervised the construction of this place in 1999, Mark answered, his voice oscillating between 2 different tones. This is where the first Neuroflex tests were conducted. They found a side entrance partially hidden by vegetation. The old lock easily yielded to the key Lucas had found along with the documents. The interior of the warehouse was dark and dusty, but surprisingly preserved. Looks like someone has been maintaining this place, Lucas observed, noting there were no cobwebs or signs of severe deterioration. Mark walked through the space as if he knew every inch, heading directly to an apparently common wall. His fingers found a disguised panel, and after a few moments of manipulation, a secret door was revealed. How? Lucas began to ask. Memories, Mark replied simply. Each day they become clearer, more present. The warehouse basement revealed a sophisticated laboratory, although clearly dated. Equipment from the 2000s shared space with carefully organized files and documents. On one of the walls, a mural covered with photographs and newspaper clippings caught both their attention. My God, Lucas whispered, approaching the mural. These are all cases of patients who used Neuroflex. Mark examined the photographs, recognizing faces through Richard's memories. These were the first ones, he explained, his voice heavy with regret. The ones who presented the most severe symptoms. What symptoms? Personality alterations, distorted memories, severe behavioral changes, Mark listed, each word weighing like lead. The drug didn't just treat neurological diseases, it fundamentally altered the brain functioning of patients. Lucas picked up a folder marked Project Nemezine. Inside, he found detailed reports on cellular memory experiments. This is from Dr. Sanders, he realized, recognizing the signature. He was involved from the beginning. Sanders was brilliant, but reckless, Mark commented, Richard's memories flowing freely now. He believed he had discovered a way to transfer memories between people through specialized cells. Neuroflex was just the beginning. So the transplant wasn't a coincidence. Mark sat heavily in an old chair, the weight of realization hitting him. Sanders knew exactly what would happen when he transplanted your grandfather's face and, hands on to me, he wanted to prove his theory was right. But why, Lucas questioned, flipping through more documents. Why risk so much? Because he needed Richard's memories, a female voice answered from the stairs. It was Sarah, emerging from the shadows like a ghost from the past. How did you find us? Mark asked, not entirely surprised by her presence. I always knew about this place, she replied, approaching. I helped build it, after all, and I knew Richard's memories would eventually bring you here. Sarah picked up one of the photographs from the mural. The consortium didn't just want to profit from Neuroflex. They wanted the real treasure, the memory transfer technology. Imagine the power of transferring knowledge, secrets, experiences from one person to another. Like they did with me, Mark concluded. Not exactly, Sarah corrected. What happened to you was something much more complex. Dr. Sanders perfected the technique. The transplant didn't just transfer Richard's memories, but also part of his consciousness. Lucas looked at his father with concern. So, Grandpa is really in there? Before Mark could answer, a noise upstairs alerted them. Heavy footsteps echoed through the warehouse. They followed us, Sarah whispered urgently. The consortium, we need to get out of here now. Not without the evidence, Mark declared, his voice sounding exactly like Richard's. He quickly went to a specific cabinet, typed a combination into a small safe that Lucas hadn't noticed, and retrieved an external hard drive and several flash drives. Richard hid backups of everything here, he explained quickly. Every file, every piece of evidence, every name involved in the Neuroflex scheme. The footsteps were approaching the lab entrance. Sarah guided them to a hidden emergency exit, a tunnel that, according to her, led to a neighboring property. As they ran, through the dark tunnel, Mark felt Richard's memories and his own mixing like never before. It was no longer just a set of memories invading his mind. It was as if two people were fighting for control, each with its own mission, its own truth to reveal. Dad? Lucas called softly, noticing his hesitation. Who's in control now? Mark looked at his son, his eyes reflecting two lives, two stories, two intertwined destinies. I don't know anymore, son. Honestly, I don't know anymore. The Miller mansion never seemed so silent as on that night. Helen watched the rain through the library window, while Mark and Lucas examined the contents of the hard drive and flash drives recovered from the secret laboratory. Sarah, seated in an old armchair, kept her eyes fixed on the door as if expecting someone might burst through it at any moment. There's much more here than we imagined, Lucas murmured, his eyes quickly scanning the spreadsheets and documents appearing on the laptop screen. It's not just evidence about Neuroflex. There are records of other experiments, other drugs. Project Nemezine was just the tip of the iceberg, Sarah explained, her voice laden with guilt. The consortium had much bigger plans. They wanted to create a way to control not just memories, but human consciousness itself. Mark, who had been silent for several minutes, suddenly stood up. His face, Richard's face, contorted in an expression of recognition. The home safe, he said abruptly. We need to check Richard's home safe. Helen turned from the window. But the police already searched everything after his stroke. Not this safe, Mark replied, his hands trembling slightly. There's a secret compartment in the basement of the old house behind the wine cellar. Richard, personally installed it without anyone knowing. How can we be sure it's not a trap? Lucas questioned. What if the consortium is monitoring the house? They are, Sarah confirmed, but they don't know about this safe. Richard never revealed its existence to anyone, except me. Helen approached her husband, studying his face with concern. In recent days, it had become increasingly difficult to distinguish when it was Mark speaking and when it was Richard's consciousness that dominated. Helen approached her husband, studying his face with concern. In recent days, it had become increasingly difficult to distinguish when it was Mark speaking and when it was Richard's consciousness that dominated. "Mark," she called softly. "Are you still there?" He looked at her, his eyes revealing an internal battle. Yes and no, it's like we're two people sharing the same space. The memories, the emotions, everything blends together. Sometimes I don't know where one ends and the other begins. Lucas's phone vibrated. A message from Rebecca. "Emergency board meeting called for tomorrow. Dr. Sanders will be present. Something's wrong." "They're making a move," Sarah warned. "The consortium must have found out about the lab. We need to act now." "I'm going to Richard's house," Mark decided. "The evidence we found in the lab is important, but what's in the secret safe is crucial. They're the original documents that prove who's really behind the consortium." "You can't go alone," Helen protested. "He won't," Lucas affirmed. "I'm going with him." Sarah stood up. "I'm going too. I know all the security systems in the house. Richard installed them after the threat started." Helen watched the three prepare to leave and made a decision. "I'll contact the press. I have trustworthy friends who can ensure the truth comes out, no matter what happens." Mark held his wife's hands, those hands that were no longer his, but still carried all the love he felt for her. "Helen, if something happens—" "No," she interrupted him. "Don't you dare say goodbye. You're coming back. Whoever you are now, Mark, Richard, or both, you're coming back to me." The journey to the old Miller mansion was tense. Mark drove in silence, his memories, both his and Richard's, guiding him through the familiar streets of Palo Alto. Lucas, in the passenger seat, kept his eyes alert for any suspicious movement, while Sarah, in the back seat, typed furiously on her cell phone. "The lab files are already secure," she informed. "I sent copies to several secure servers. Even if they catch us, the truth will survive." As they approached the old mansion, they noticed the lights were on. Mark stopped the car at a safe distance. "Someone's inside," Lucas whispered. "Yes," Mark replied, his voice taking on Richard's deep tone. "And I think I know exactly who it is. Dr. Sanders wouldn't miss the opportunity to recover his original research." "How are we going to get in?" Lucas asked. An enigmatic smile, so characteristic of Richard, appeared on Mark's face. "Through the secret passage in the back of the property, the same tunnel Richard used to escape the night he discovered the truth about the consortium." Sarah nodded. "The night he should have been eliminated, but managed to fake his own disappearance." "The stroke was a fake?" Lucas asked, shocked. "No," Mark answered, painful memories emerging. "The stroke was real, but it happened later. When Richard finally decided to confront the consortium, they silenced him with a modified version of Neuroflex itself, the last move of a desperate man to preserve the evidence that could destroy an empire built on lies." The three got out of the car in silence, preparing to face what awaited them inside the mansion. What would they find in the secret safe? And more importantly, when the night ended, who would Mark Miller really be? The secret passage was a narrow tunnel that snaked under the mansion's garden. Mark led the way, his hands, Richard's hands, sliding along the damp walls with familiarity. Lucas and Sarah followed in silence, only the echo of their footsteps breaking the underground quietude. "Your grandfather built this passage in 1995, Mark explained to Lucas, his voice alternating between tones. "He always knew that one day he would need an escape route." "Like someone who lived a lifetime of paranoia," Sarah added. "In the end, he was right about everything." They reached an old metal door. Mark typed a sequence of numbers on a partially rusted keypad, and the door opened with a soft creak. They emerged in an area of the wine cellar that looked abandoned, filled with empty wine racks and cobwebs. "The safe is behind that false wall," Mark whispered, pointing to an apparently ordinary wooden panel. Muffled voices from upstairs made them stop. Lucas silently approached the cellar stairs and strained his ears. "Must be somewhere in this house," Dr. Sanders' voice echoed. Richard would never let his life's work disappear without a backup. "You guaranteed the transplant would work," a second voice, unknown and authoritative, replied. "You said the memories would be transferred, that we could extract the location of the evidence directly from his mind." "And it worked," Sanders protested. "Mark Miller is gradually transforming into Richard. The memories are there. We just need to—" "We need to eliminate him," the unknown voice interrupted. "Just like we eliminated Richard. The consortium can't risk this information coming to light." Sarah gripped Mark's arm tightly. "It's Alexander Porter's voice," she whispered, "the consortium president. He rarely appears in person." Mark felt a wave of anger, Richard's anger, course through his body. Memories of the day he confronted Porter flooded his mind. The tense meeting, the veiled threats, the bitter taste of the coffee that he now knew was contaminated with the modified version of Neuroflex. "I'm going to create a distraction," Sarah decided. "I know this house as well as Richard did. I can lead them away from the cellar." "It's too dangerous," Lucas protested. "I have a debt to your grandfather," she replied, "and to the truth." Before they could stop her, Sarah was already silently climbing the stairs. Seconds later, they heard a crash upstairs, followed by raised voices and hurried footsteps moving away. "Now," Mark commanded, moving quickly to the wooden panel. The safe mechanism was complex, a combination of numerical password and physical key. Mark removed a chain from his neck, where a small antique key hung discreetly. "Richard always kept it with him," he explained, his hands trembling slightly as he inserted the key, "even in the hospital, during the coma." The safe opened with a soft click, revealing its interior. Inside was a red folder with the Global Pharmaceuticals logo and an old tablet carefully preserved. "These are the original records," Mark murmured, leafing through the documents. "All the secret experiments, the illegal tests, the names of those involved, Porter, Sanders, all of them." Lucas picked up the tablet. "And this?" "The final proof," Mark replied, Richard's memories flowing freely now. "Recordings of the consortium meetings. Richard installed hidden cameras in his own boardroom. He knew he would need irrefutable evidence." A noise on the stairs alerted them. Dr. Sanders emerged from the shadows holding a syringe. "Fascinating," the doctor commented, his eyes shining with scientific interest. "The fusion of consciousnesses is even more complete than I expected. Are you Mark or Richard now?" "I'm both," Mark replied, his voice firm. "And neither. You played God, Sanders, but you didn't foresee the consequences." "On the contrary," Sanders smiled, "I predicted exactly this, the perfect consciousness transfer experiment. You are my masterpiece." "You're a monster," Lucas accused, placing himself between the doctor and his father. "I'm a visionary," Sanders corrected. "And now I need to ensure my work isn't interrupted." He advanced with the syringe, but a voice stopped him. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." It was Helen, standing at the top of the stairs. Beside her, several federal agents pointed their weapons at the cellar. Sarah appeared right behind, a victorious smile on her face. "It's over, Sanders," Helen declared. "The lab files are already with the press. Porter is being detained as we speak. The consortium has fallen." Sanders let the syringe drop, his shoulders sagging in defeat. As the agents handcuffed him, Mark felt a strange sense of peace. Richard's memories, so chaotic before, now seemed to settle naturally alongside his own. "Dad?" Lucas called softly. "How are you?" Mark looked at his son, then at Helen, who was descending the stairs towards him. For the first time since the transplant, he felt he finally knew who he was. "I'm here," he answered simply. "Both of us. And now I know exactly what we need to do." 6 months later, the TechMinds headquarters was unrecognizable. The old mirrored walls had given way to a more transparent facade, both literally and metaphorically. In the president's office, Mark Miller observed the city through the renovated windows, his hands, still bearing Richard's marks and wrinkles, gently holding a cup of coffee. "The latest clinical trial results have arrived," Lucas announced, entering the room with a folder. "The new Neuroflex, reformulated and safe, is ready to be presented to the FDA." Mark smiled, a gesture that now seemed perfectly natural on his transformed face. "Your grandfather would be proud. We're finally using the technology for the good it should have always provided." The fusion between father and son, both physical and metaphorical, had stabilized in recent months. Richard's memories no longer fought for control. Instead, they complemented Mark's experience, offering unique wisdom and perspective. Helen entered the room carrying a newspaper. "Dr. Sanders's sentence came out today. 15 years for illegal experimentation and complicity in the consortium's crimes." "And Porter?" Lucas asked. 25 years along with the other consortium members," Helen replied. "The judge was particularly severe after Richard's recordings came to light." Mark stood up, walking to the wall where a new picture now hung, a photograph of Richard Miller in his last days, smiling serenely in his garden. "You know," he began, his voice carrying the deep understanding that only someone who had lived 2 lives could have. "For years I thought my father was just a bitter man, obsessed with power and secrets. Now I understand he was waging a lonely battle to protect innocent people." "And now?" Lucas questioned. "What's it like, being both?" Mark turned to his son. "It's like having a constant mentor, a second perspective on everything. His memories are no longer invasive, they're a gift, a legacy that helps me be a better person." Sarah, who now held the position of Research and Development Director at TechMinds, joined them in the office. "The new ethics protocols are implemented in all laboratories. Each project goes through 3 independent committees before approval." "And Project Mnemosyne?" Helen asked. "Archived," Mark replied firmly. "The memory transfer technology is too powerful to be commercially exploited. Perhaps in the future, when humanity is ready." Rebecca interrupted through the intercom. "Mr. Miller, the representatives from the public hospital's social program have arrived for the meeting." Lucas smiled. "The project you wanted to cancel 6 months ago, and which is now our priority," Mark completed. "Sometimes we need to lose everything to understand what really matters." As they walked to the meeting room, Mark paused briefly in front of a mirror in the hallway. The face looking back at him was no longer a source of conflict or confusion. It was a constant reminder that people can change, evolve and transform into something greater than the sum of their parts. Helen intertwined her fingers with his. "What are you thinking about?" "About how unpredictable life is," he replied. "An accident that should have destroyed me ended up rebuilding me. The memories that should have driven me insane brought me clarity, and a father I thought had never loved me spent his last moments trying to protect me." Lucas put his hand on his father's shoulder. "And now?" "Now we live," Mark replied, his words carrying the wisdom of 2 generations. "We live and honor the legacy entrusted to us, not through power or money, but through actions that make a difference in people's lives." The group entered the meeting room where representatives from various public hospitals were waiting. Mark, now a single person forged from the unlikely union of father and son, took his place at the head of the table. In his hands, the documents of the new project that would transform public health in the country. In his heart, the certainty that he had finally found his true purpose. "Let's begin," he announced, his voice carrying Mark's strength and Richard's wisdom. "We have a lot of work ahead of us." Outside the room, the San Francisco sun shone over the city, its lights reflecting on TechMinds' renovated windows. A new era was beginning, not just for the Millers, but for all those whose lives they would touch. And somewhere in the shared memories of father and son, Richard Miller finally rested in peace, knowing that his legacy was in good hands. After all, sometimes you need to completely lose yourself to truly find yourself. And sometimes, the greatest gift a father can give his son is the chance to be a better person than either of them ever were separately.